Hi everybody, my name is Lynn Hayes. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'll be talking about the conjunction of Jupiter to Saturn, which takes place at 0 degrees Aquarius. So before I launch into the conjunction, I want to talk a little bit about Aquarius and the Aquarian Age. We don't really know exactly when the age of Aquarius is going to start. The turning of the ages is a big cycle. It happens every 2150 years. So it's not like we can pinpoint the day when the age of Aquarius begins. We don't even know which 100 years it takes place in. There's an idea that the age of Pisces began somewhere around the time of the birth of Jesus or the origin of Christianity, because there are many significators of the age of Pisces that we find in Christianity. Jesus was the fisher of men. The sign for Christianity is the fish. The sign for Pisces is the fish. Pisces is traditionally ruled by Jupiter, and Jupiter has to do with religion. The age of Pisces has been the age of religion. Now we're moving into the age of Aquarius at some point, sometime either in the last couple hundred years or in the next couple hundred years, or it could be right now. But there are a lot of signs that the age of Aquarius has already begun. The focus on technology, the sort of blurring of the genders is a very Aquarian concept. The ideas of freedom and liberty are very Aquarian. And we're seeing signs all around us that the old order is fading and the new order is coming. And there is a big schism right now between people that are holding on to the old order and people that are wanting to bring in the new order. And I mention that in this particular video because Jupiter and Saturn conjoin in the sign of Aquarius. And we're talking about the age of Aquarius. I don't want to spend the whole video talking about the age of Aquarius, but I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're talking about Jupiter and Saturn both entering Aquarius at the same time and bringing in this burst of Aquarian energy, especially at a time like this, when we are dealing with a pandemic, where we have been dealing with a triple conjunction of planets in the sign of Capricorn, which includes Jupiter and Saturn. They've both been traveling together, although not really ever aligned exactly. But they've both been together through the sign of Capricorn, where we've been dealing with repression and where we've been dealing with building new structures to support us. Now we move from Saturn-ruled Capricorn into Saturn-ruled Aquarius with this conjunction. Jupiter represents the expansive principle. It has to do with freedom and enlargement of things and opportunities. It's very positive in nature, optimistic. Saturn is not any of those things. Saturn reacts to Jupiter by putting a kibosh on anything that is too expansive. Saturn is about restrictions and limitations. It's about hard work, and it's about respecting the boundaries of the material world. And Saturn itself forms the boundary of the visible planets. Saturn is the ruler of Capricorn, where Jupiter and Saturn have both been traveling through over the last year. Saturn is also the ruler of Aquarius. It's the traditional ruler. Saturn's rulership of Aquarius is a difficult concept to swallow. We think of Aquarius as being inventive and creative and independent and eccentric. All of those attributes are better described by Uranus. Saturn's rulership of Aquarius, though, better describes the sort of coldness, the tendency towards isolation of Aquarius. Aquarius is the paradigm buster, and that can be a lonely position to be in. If you're the only one that's at the gate screaming to be let in, screaming for revolution and for paradigm change, that can be a lonely place to be. So there is a sense of isolation with Aquarius, even though Aquarius is very friendly, very outgoing, very concerned with community and with bringing people together. But there's more of a sense of the collective than of the personal. Aquarius really transcends the personal and focuses more on the structure of the community. And in that way, we can see the rulership of Saturn a little more clearly. So this idea that when we move into the age of Aquarius and the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of Aquarius is going to bring all this kind of magical brotherhood and equality, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by putting too much focus on this idea. that will not prepare us for the reality. And one way to look at Aquarius and Uranus and this idea of revolution is to think about the French Revolution. The French Revolution started out very noble. And in fact, Pluto was in Aquarius at the time of the French Revolution. There was this beginning of, equality and rebellion against the nobles that were trampling on the peasants who were starving. But then the revolution evolved into a reign of terror where people were murdered and where there was this requirement that your politics had to be pure. There was a great deal of judgment about your ideals and your ideas. And this too is very Aquarian. How righteous are you going to be to the revolution? This is something that we're already seeing when we're talking about the pandemic and masks and whether to wear a mask or not and how political this is becoming. Aquarius, after all, is a fixed sign. It's an air sign, but it's fixed in nature. There can be a stubbornness and a difficulty in adaptation. So once the change occurs, there can be a fixedness with how we see that change. We've just been through a year of repression. We've had lockdown, we've had a lot of government control. There's understandably a lot of resistance to that and a lot of rebellion about that. But with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, I don't feel like things are automatically going to be just liberated. I feel that moving forward into this new way of looking at the world, we're going to have to remember to maintain some flexibility. We will likely see around us ideas changing, but becoming very fixed and judgmental under that Aquarian influence. But we ourselves can't really control the world. All we can control is ourselves. And so in the midst of that, I think it's going to be very useful to always keep our eyes open. The one thing about Aquarius with its modern rulership of Uranus is it's very open to innovation. It's open to new ideas. It just has trouble making that shift into the new way of living under those ideas. But there's going to be a tremendous amount of innovation, certainly, with Jupiter and Saturn both conjunct in Aquarius. New technologies, new ways of communicating with each other. We're already seeing that under the influence of the pandemic, and we're on Zoom talking to people all around the world. Of course, I've done that for years anyway, but it's more the norm. People are playing music together in different parts of the world that have never really linked up before. So there is this tremendous opening and a tremendous possibility for new ways of living our life as we have to give up the old ways. Under the influence of Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius, we will likely be moving away from the idea of capitalism as a concentration of resources in the hands of the few. Multinational corporations, billionaires. Now, I have nothing against billionaires, and I am not a socialist. I just want to preface all this by saying that. I like money as much as the next person, but there's certainly no doubt that over the last certainly 12 years with Pluto in the sign of Capricorn, the concentration of resources has really led to a great amount of income inequality. And that creates the potential for a tremendous amount of social stress. And when we're talking about Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius, we could be certainly looking at more uprisings, more conflict as the have-nots start to fight against the haves. And we will see that even more when Pluto moves into Aquarius in 2023. That used to seem like a long time away, but it's coming up in just a couple of years. More of an equalized distribution of the economic situation is likely in the near future, and we will likely begin to see more of what some people may call socialism, but really has more to do with increasing an equitable distribution of resources in the world. Ideally, this would happen smoothly by people walking into this voluntarily so that we don't see it through revolution and something that occurs more violently. And remember, if you're living in the United States, all of this is coming at the time of the U.S. Pluto return. There is a sore that's festering at the heart of the Union, and it has to do with racism. It has to do with income inequality. This starts back, when the country was first founded. We had the wealthy people that came from England that were given grants of huge amounts of land. And then we had the poor people escaping from religious persecution in England. So really, the country started out with income inequality, which I should say is found everywhere that humans exist. It's not unique to the United States by any means. But what makes the United States fairly unique is the factor of slavery, because when you bring in slavery and then you have the whole racial component, which other countries have certainly, and more as globalization has caused the mixing and more migration in the 1990s and 2000s, under Pluto and Sagittarius, by the way. All this sort of mixing has brought about more racial inequality and more racial strife. And with Pluto in Aquarius, I think we're going to see more of a struggle towards greater equality. And in the United States in particular, we're finishing up the end of Pluto in Capricorn, which is returning to its place in the chart of the United States. The Pluto return is bringing up all of this anger and rage, and we're seeing a lot of racism that we thought was over. It's all sort of coming out. So this is sort of a depressing video, I guess, and I don't mean it to be depressing, but I think we really have to keep our eyes open and really look at the ideal, which is a world where humans can live happily in some sort of equality, not socialism where everybody is given something equal and there's no incentive for hard work, but certainly a life where humans have at least some sort of potential and opportunity. But the greater the push for enhanced equality and increased social justice, the greater will be the resistance of the old order that doesn't want to give up their sense of place. And that's where the strife comes in. There's a real sense right now of the conflict between the old way of living, the old morals, marriages between a man and a woman, races should be separate. That's really the old way of thinking. And there's a lot of conflict right now between that and the reality of the new world, that there is a mixing pot, that we are all mixing as humans, that not everybody identifies as male or female, that there's some fluidity there. These are all very new concepts that are scary to some people. What's really interesting about this particular conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius is that for the first time in 800 years, the conjunction is moving from Earth into air. The conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn occur in the same element for about 200 years. There is an outlier at the beginning of the cycle and at the end of the cycle. It's almost like a little harbinger. For example, in 1980, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was in Libra, an air sign. That was sort of a harbinger of the air cycle, but then it slipped back into Earth until this particular cycle, where we move into Aquarius and into air for the next 200 years. The elemental cycles last for about 200 years, and the Earth cycle began around 1842. And we can really argue that that was the beginning of modern civilization, the Industrial Revolution, different ways of communication, industrial capitalism, which is very much, these are very much earthy concepts. Under the teaser cycle in air, the conjunction that occurred in Libra in 1980, we started to have this influx of new communication devices. We started to have personal computers. The proliferation of the internet occurred under this conjunction cycle. Air has a lot to do with communication, information, learning, and ideas. So we're moving from this very practical 200-year cycle of Earth where we're building and it's all about money and governments and schools and corporations, and moving into the realm of ideas. We're likely to see the entire nature of corporate living change completely. Under the pandemic, we're already seeing this because corporations are having to adapt by having their people work from home. That means that we're working remotely. That's intensifying the need for a stronger internet and for different technological advances to help us to communicate more in this way. It's also, of course, going to change the way that we educate our children, that we engage in any kind of commerce. And wealth will no longer be derived from things so much as it was during this Earth cycle, where everything was about manufacturing and producing. Wealth will now likely be derived more from ideas, innovation, and different ways of communication. The last conjunction cycle in air began in the year 1226, and this was around the time when the Magna Carta was signed. The Magna Carta was an entirely new legal document that set out the need for personal liberties, essentially. There had been a tyrannical king, and the nobles wanted to protect themselves against that ever happening again. This idea of a tyrannical king would have been right in line with the previous conjunctions of Capricorn, just as we have now. I always like to take a practical perspective, something that's helpful for these planetary cycles. And this is a 200-year cycle of air, so it's not like something that's just going to happen overnight for us. But from a practical perspective, in December 2020, with Jupiter and Saturn going into Aquarius, I think it's fair to say that there's going to be a big awakening of some kind. Things are changing. This is frightening for many people. Some people are wired to embrace change. People with a lot of air and fire in their charts love the excitement. People with a lot of earth and water in their charts can be fearful of change. It's disruptive. But change is definitely coming. We can't avoid it, whether we want to or not. So to be prepared for this big change, I feel like it's very useful for all of us. I think I've been saying this for weeks now, really, but we have been in a situation where our options have been so limited in this pandemic. But that's really forced us to look at what's important. We've had to look at our friendships, our relationships. Who do we want in our quarantine pod? What is staying in our lives and what's leaving? What can we let go of? What do we really need to bring? It's an incredible time for visualization. It's the perfect time to really take stock of what is important and how we want our lives to look going forward, knowing that we're moving into a completely different reality. What is it that we want to bring with us? I'll be talking about this a lot more as time goes on, of course. As always, I really appreciate your being here with me. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time.